Okay, we're recording. So welcome everyone. I'm Luis Pessoa, and this is the Neuroscience and Philosophy Salon, where we get together once in a while when we have the opportunity, the time, and we can to discuss topics in at the interface of neuroscience and philosophy, or neuroscience and conceptual issues. So the goal is really to encourage philosophy and neuroscience to come together and contribute to our thinking so that we can advance perhaps philosophy. But as a neuroscientist, I'm really interested in developing ways in which we can uh, contribute to making neuroscience more attuned to conceptual and philosophical issues that can hopefully improve the way we do our research and our science. So today, I'm really happy that we have Kevin Mitchell. Kevin is an associate professor of genetics and neuroscience at Trinity College, Dublin. And let me just accept some people here on the admit. And Kevin is going to be primarily focusing, has written extensively, a really influential book on free will, but he's going to be focusing mostly on a recent paper that he wrote with Henry Potter. And, and the idea is to have Kevin describe the main ideas of this paper and how to take the notion of causation and mechanisms and expand it in a way that encourages the field of neuroscience to think of and incorporate multiple ways to think about causation and mechanisms, causation more broadly speaking, into the way that we do actually our neuroscience on a day-to-day basis. And Kevin builds quite a bit on the work of Peter Tse, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience and chair of the Department of Psychological and Brain Science at Dartmouth University here in the US. And obviously Kevin and Henry are in Ireland. And Peter was kind enough to join us and to contribute to the discussion. So the idea that I have for today is for Kevin to put out some of the main ideas of this piece and his current way of thinking about causation and how we can expand our views of causation. And because again, it touches so much on Peter's work, to let Peter say a few things, 5-10 minutes, or however he wants to use afterwards. And then we open for discussion. So I think that in this first part of 20 plus minutes, I think it would be better to let Kevin kind of focus on the presentation, because these are really deep, challenging, broad questions. I think we can maybe refrain from asking questions at that point. We can ask after the presentation, after Peter has a chance to also add to it. But if there are clarification, I should say, clarification questions during the presentation, just raise your hand, or you can just, ask directly. You don't even have to raise your hand, because it would be maybe useful to clarify a few issues that I don't think we would have a. Are you okay with that, Kevin?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Because
Yeah.
then we can clarify right there and then. But obviously, let's not ask the meaning of the universe kind of question right in the middle, because we're going to have time for that afterwards. So with that, I will stop and pass it on to Kevin.
That's great. Thanks so much, Louise. I'm just going to share my screen here if I can find the right thing. And thanks, Peter, for joining, and thanks, Henry, for joining as well. So, of course, Henry and I wrote this paper together. And let's see if let me try that again. Sorry, one sec. Technical issue here. Man, it's time to get a new laptop. This thing is so... Okay, here we go. Stop that. Arg. Sorry. Try this again. Oh, okay. Of course, that's when my PowerPoint decided to quit. I see what's
We could
happening.
see it, so maybe you don't
Could you?
have
Okay.
to go
Well,
into
no,
presentation mode, but
yeah, there's no, of course it only
oh,
happens like when I'm trying to do this. Okay, let me try again. Go away. No. Apologies.
it crashed or something?
Who the hell?
Yeah.
Wait, it's there. Okay. All right, third time lucky. All right. Can you see that? Maybe I will leave it without going into present. Okay, good. I'm not gonna
Yeah,
not
we
gonna
can
mess
see
with
it.
anything
Yeah,
else.
and it's
Okay.
very small this side, so it won't interfere much at all.
Okay, great.
It's good.
Um, cool. Okay, so yeah, so this is a paper that Henry and I wrote. It came out in this special issue of the European Journal of Neuroscience, which was titled something like a philosophical toolkit for neuroscience, and that was really what we were interested in here. And the main thing we were sort of getting at was this question of what are the causes of behavior, which a lot of neuroscience is concerned with. And in modern neuroscience, that's often taken to just mean some neural states. Like the job of neuroscience is taken to be finding the neural states that are the causes of behavior, and those are the neural mechanisms of a behavior. And a lot of that work is has been made more powerful by things like optogenetics, where we can drive some neurons, which drive some other neurons, which drive a behavior. And that driving metaphor is very implicit in a lot of the way that those experiments are interpreted, and sometimes it's very explicit in the way that they're described. So people will say that the firing of these neurons is necessary for a behavior and it's sufficient for the behavior, and of course that's done in really tightly controlled experiments. But the implication and sometimes the interpretation is that when an animal does that behavior in the wild, that's what's happening, right? Those neurons are firing. That's the cause of the behavior. And that reflects a reductionist kind of approach in neuroscience methodologically, which is perfectly fine and normal. This is how a lot of science just works, that we do controlled experiments. We keep as many background, factors constant as possible. And then we isolate causal relations with a kind of a promissory note that later on we'll put them back together to make sense of the whole system, right? And this is really powerful, it's really effective, and it gives power to predict and control and intervene on the system in a way that can make it seem like that's all there is, right? We're done. What else would you want? If you can predict what's going to happen and control it, then surely you understand everything about it that's causally relevant. The problem is that there's a theoretical sort of side to reductionism, which is a commitment that we don't really have to make. It's often unnecessarily eliminative. It explains away that the very things that we want to understand, which is how the brain and the mind and cognition and behavior all relate to each other. And I think it's not needed. And in particular, it's not licensed by the success of methodological reductionism. Just because the methods work doesn't mean we have to be committed to the idea that we can do away with thinking about things like thoughts and beliefs and desires and cognition, that's all epiphenomenal, and really it's just neural engineering. It's just all mechanism at the lowest level, as Francis Crick kind of incorporated in this famous quote. So I think that there are now. Shoot, I'm going to have to go to full screen. Hope this works here. Everything disappeared. Okay, let me try. I'm going to try that again. No, fuck you. Okay.
It crashes on your end. Is that what happens? We lose it
Yeah,
here, but it
yeah, yeah,
crashes.
yeah.
Is that what it is? Yeah,
All
yeah.
right, sorry. I have some animations that are not going to work well, but let me just try
Oh,
again.
I see. Yeah, yeah, right.
Um, so what I was going to say, one second,
Yeah,
is that this kind of Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
Another strategy would be to send the PowerPoint to Luis, and then he could share his screen, and you could then tell him go to slide 3, go to slide 4, etc.
I don't even trust that it'll work that way, but this should be okay. Can you guys see this slide again now? Okay.
We can see it.
Okay, great. That's fine. I can work it this way. So there's several sort of aspects of reductionism that are applied here. On the left, we can see this sort of vertical reduction, which means reduction in levels, ontologically speaking, from the mental down to the physical, right? So from cognitive down to neural mechanisms, with the idea being that all the real causation is at the neural level and the cognitive stuff just kind of floats above it. Then in the middle, there's this sort of horizontal reduction, which is to say isolation of components, where we can say what the cause is, these neurons fired. And that was the cause. So we're isolating parts and losing all the context. And of course, the danger is there that you see the agent disappears, right? The parts are doing all the work, the agent's being pushed around by what happens within it. And then the third kind here, which is less obvious, is temporal reduction. It's just looking at exactly what's happening right now, the current state, and saying all of the causation we can understand by looking at the current state, and we can ignore how it came to be that way. And I think those are, we don't have to be committed to any of those things. And I think they impoverished in our view of what's going on in the control of behavior. So our goal was to think of ways that we could think of causation less reductively, to look to the philosophical literature on causation to get some resources that can help us there, and then to think, can that help us as neuroscientists? So one really important distinction that's made in the philosophical literature is between production and dependence causes. And I think most people think of the causes of things as the physical events that are happening. So the production causes are the things that supply the oomph. So if you want to say, why did these billiard balls split apart, then you might say, well, the cause is that they were struck by the cue ball. And it's not wrong. I mean, in the sense that if the cue ball hadn't struck them, they wouldn't have split apart, right? It's just not complete because there's a bunch of other causes that are at play, these dependence causes, which are all the conditions necessary for the event to happen as it did. So they include, for example, the friction of the felt, the materials that the balls are made out of. If they were made out of marshmallows, then they wouldn't have split apart in the way that they did, right? These things are kind of background conditions and they're often ignored. They also include, really importantly here, the arrangement of the balls, right? The fact that they're packed into a triangle like that is really important for explaining what happens next. So those kinds of dependence causes can be just really generic, like the laws of physics, the chemistry of the stuff that these things are made out of, and so on. But they can also be more local and more interesting. And in particular, they can have functional importance and they can be a record of prior history. And that's the kind of dependence cause that is there in the nervous system. And this gets to some work by Fred Dretske, philosopher, who made a distinction that I find super useful between triggering and structuring causes. The idea here is that you may find that A, some event, triggers X, right? So cause triggers some effect. You say A is the cause of X, especially again, if in the sense that if A hadn't happened, then X wouldn't have happened, right? So you can get a kind of counterfactual causation that way. But you can also ask another question, which is, why did A trigger X? What are the structuring causes that made the system be organized in the way that it is, such that A triggers X? And if we don't kind of encompass those causes as well, those historical causes that are diachronic, right? They're stretched through time, then we don't get a full explanation. It's a very impoverished kind of a view. And that kind of reflects a history of causal pluralism. It goes back to Aristotle's four causes, but you can see it with Tinbergen and Marr and so on. And one of the sort of key points here is to think beyond these physical oomph causes that actually constraints are causes. The way a system is organized constrains the possibility space of what might happen. And Alicia Huerero has written a lot on this really nicely. And those can be global constraints. They can be top-down constraints that constrain the possibility space, and they can be enabling. So they're not just restrictive, they enable lower level parts to have higher level functions, which becomes really important because we don't want to just keep drilling down in the nervous system. So the upshot then is that causation doesn't have to be all bottom up, partly because the low-level details don't fully specify the subsequent states of the system. Because there's indeterminacy in the system, there's noise in the nervous system in particular, it creates some causal slack. What that means is that the system can become organized in ways that are functional through selection, and that macroscopic organization can have a real causal influence on what happens. And this is where Peter's work became really relevant, and I think captures the essence of this kind of causation in the nervous system itself, which is to say that a neuron's firing doesn't just depend on its inputs, it depends on the way that it's configured, and that configuration encodes or embodies criteria for firing. So they set the sensitivity of the neuron to specific aspects of its inputs that reflect its past history, of course, learning and synaptic plasticity and so on, but also its current state, any top-down constraints that are in play, any neuromodulation that's in play, and so on. So we have a system that I think we can view, rather than thinking of this driving view where, you know, we apply some stimulus or some electrical activity to neuron A and it drives neuron B and that drives neuron C and eventually drives behavior. Instead, we can reverse that. We can say, actually, the causal work here is, or a lot of the causal work is being done by neuron B. It's interpreting its inputs. And in a sense, like any cell, is asking what's going on out there and what should I do about it? And that depends on the criteria that have been configured here in the way that the circuit is set up. Those configurations might be set by evolution. So you can have control policies that are kind of just pragmatic. You can have simple reflexes. You can have slightly more complicated sets of control policies that allow a kind of contextual responses to a situation, not just isolated stimuli. But then, of course, you can get, you know, in more complex nervous systems where sensors and motors are split further apart, then you get more interesting things because you have these internal representations. They come to mean something, right? Those are meaningful patterns that are grounded through experience. They're linked to prior knowledge. They can be used to inform action, but they're not obligately driving action. So here now you have a whole sort of different level where the currency in the system is really the meaning of these states. And I think, you know, the argument is that that's really true. It's not just an epiphenomenon, that those patterns do entail beliefs, emotions, desires, goals, and so on, and that the meaning of those things is what's really important. And so it becomes interesting to ask, well, how would we know that? Why is it, you know, why am I licensed to make the claim that the details of the neural firing are not all doing all the work? And one way to think about that is this, well, first of all, just to observe how noisy the nervous system is, how much information is lost in synaptic transmission, all the filtering and integration that goes on there, and all of which leads to properties of multiple realizability. And one way to think about that is counterfactually. So again, if we say A is identified as the cause of X, that means if A happened, X should happen. But it also means if A didn't happen, X should not happen. Okay, so both of those criteria have to be in play. And when you have multiple realizability, what that means is that A may be a macro state, where what's important is the macrostate pattern, not the microstate details. So the system may actually be insensitive to a lot of the microstate details in the sense of this counterfactual causation. That's illustrated here with the idea that you can have a population of neurons that's monitoring another population, where this population may be in, you know, a bunch of different microstate patterns, but all of these ones here represent pattern A because they're interpreted by this one to be pattern A. So the meaning here is very interpretive in the system. It's not entailed in these patterns, it's entailed in the relation that's here. And well, all of these are represented as pattern B. And we can see that kind of thing in lots of you know, modern neuroscience, systems neuroscience methods. Here's just one example of that. So what I take that to mean is that this view of eliminative reductionism just shouldn't hold, that the idea that we can reduce away or eliminate these psychological states and just say, actually, all the real work is done by neural syntax, right? It's just the neural patterns it's just the neural activity that's important. It doesn't matter what it means. And, you know, you can take that to this sort of reductio ad absurdum and say it's just physics. But I think that the opposite is true. I want to invert that idea that actually it's the meaning that drives the mechanism, and the meaning is the currency in the system, that all of these things have causal power in this system by virtue of what they mean. And that we have to have that historical, diachronic, criterial kind of view to make sense of that. So for me, and for Henry, I think as well, the implications for neuroscience, first of all, is that this diachronic view enriches our understanding. It goes beyond this mere mechanism. And you know, the way I phrase this is that we can do ethology, right? We can actually study behavior and cognition and psychology. We don't have to eliminate those things. We don't have to just do electrical engineering. And it means that the meaning really is the currency in the system. The neural activity is just the medium. And for experiments, that means we should think about what's the right level at which we should look for causal sensitivity in the system. And it's probably not going to be the lowest level. And I think that jibes with the direction that systems neuroscience is going these days, especially with not just things like, looking for these low dimensional manifolds and so on, but the fact that a lot of those representations seem to be affordance-based. They're not just about something the animal is perceiving, they're about what the animal can do with the thing or how it's relevant in particular in relation to a task that it's engaged in, and so on. And then for philosophy, they're also important for understanding things like mental causation and agent causation and ultimately free will, because if we don't have this kind of diachronic view where an agent is a self that's extended through time, that's incorporating its own history into its physical structure in ways that allow it to adapt to the future and control its behavior, then these other kind of constructs just almost don't get off the ground. It's just too eliminative. So I have a couple other slides on that, but I realize I've taken some time with all this other nonsense. So I'll just end it there. There's a few related works that are here, including this book, and I'll be happy to have a broader chat. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was perfect. That was very clear and summarized so many of the ideas that you had in your paper.
Great.
So yeah, so as I mentioned, let's start with Peter having some comments and his own view of causation and yeah, Peter, please.
Well, I agree with all of this. I think it's just obviously true. I think neuroscience just has to catch up. So there are so many directions I could talk about it, but I don't want to talk for too long. So I'll just first mention, the word meaning itself has different connotations, one of which is, I would say, consequentiality for an animal, another of which is goal fulfillment. So let me give an example of consequentiality. This is the distinction between information and meaning that I think the biologist Gregory Bateson made when he said that information is if information is a difference, meaning is a difference that makes a difference. So just for a concrete example, let's say that I ask Kevin, do you like dogs? And he says yes. Well, okay. So I have to I have a node in my knowledge space where I store things about Kevin, and I update that, and that reduction from two possibilities, yes and no, to one is 1 bit. Now let's say, well, I shouldn't use Kevin as an example here. That some beautiful woman who's brilliant and kind and good, I'm in love with her and I want to marry her, and I ask her, will you marry me? Now, if she says yes or no, it's still 1 bit in the Shannon-esque conception of a reduction from two possibilities to one. But in terms of meaning, it's vastly different from the former example of, do you like a dog or not? Because in this case, I have to update not only one little node, I have to update the whole node corresponding to my knowledge of the world and my imagined future. So obviously, meaning has one meaning of consequentiality, and we have to really distinguish that. Another meaning of meaning, and there are actually several, is goal fulfillment. Does this help me accomplish my goals? And if I'm hungry, I don't know, lasagna has a lot more meaning to me or significance than if I'm not hungry, right? So it depends on my state. So identical inputs can have different meanings depending on my state. Now, I would say, in addition to all the things that Kevin said, all of which I agree with, there's another conception of causation that has to be brought into neuroscience, which is the notion of cybernetic feedback loops, or closed loop causation. So just to, I don't know if everybody knows different sorts of vocabulary, but the word cybernetics was used by Norbert Wiener in the 1940s to describe sort of like thermostat-like systems where an external set point, say of a thermostat, is set by some person, say to be 20 degrees Celsius. And then there's some error signals saying, if it gets too hot, turn the furnace off. And then if it gets too cold, turn the furnace on, and so forth. So the system has a set point and it has error signals that detect divergence from that, and it essentially corrects. So, I guess homeostatically or allostatically, it returns to the set point. Now, Powers built on this idea and said, well, actually, for biological systems, the set point is not only internal, it's not set by an external engineer. Obviously, we have, needs as an animal, say hydration, and there's some error signal that detects, low hydration, and then we get thirsty and we seek out water. Or we overdrink and we find water repulsive, right? So there's a similar kind of return to a set point, in this case of ideal hydration. And, I think what Powers did, he took the notion of cybernetics and added really the subjective into this, so that animals evolved to be cybernetic, but not with external set points, but with evolutionarily selected internal set points. And we experience those error signals as lust, thirst, hunger, and so forth, and the other desires, but also higher level teleological goals, like, loneliness, for example. That would be a set point. That would be an error signal where if I have not been around people enough, or I'm looking for a romantic partner, I feel lonely, and I seek out a way to diminish that error signal. Now, if I'm with people too long, I get sick of them maybe, and then I, seek isolation from people, right? So a lot of things in life cycle because of these closed loop cybernetic feedback loops. Now, the feedback loops tend to be negative. Now, so a negative feedback loop is where a difference is made smaller on each cycle, whereas a positive feedback loop is made bigger on each cycle. So, a positive feedback loop would be like our society has been experiencing, where the rich get richer and the middle class gets poorer. And, this typically in nature and in society leads to collapse. It's not a sustainable solution, where in the end, if you played that out in our society, one person would own everything and everybody else would own nothing and starve, right? That's not a sustainable situation. And if you want to see, positive feedback loops in action, type in Tacoma Bay Bridge collapse. It's a wonderful movie. But negative feedback loops are the essence of cybernetics. And they are based on minimizing some error. A good example would be if I push you, well, you're going to error correct. Your set point is to be vertical, and you want to return to verticality. So you'll make some rough first step, and then error correct again, and make a smaller step, and so forth, until the error signal is minimized to zero, and you are again upright. Now, I think what Powers did beyond all of this is he realized that the whole biological system is not just one cybernetic loop, but multiple stacked all the way up, right? So that the error minimization in the case of the pushing example is an error signal that leads to a motor act. But many higher level cybernetic loops don't have as their output a motor act, but the changing of a set point of a lower level cybernetic loop. And another deep insight of Powers, I think, is that he realized that behavior doesn't drive the input. The output, right? So it's not that behavior is oriented towards changing the output. that's how most people think about it. It's actually oriented towards changing the input. So, for example, it's not the case that I look at a restaurant and get hungry typically. It's typically the case that I'm hungry and then go look for a restaurant. And I move my eyes in the service of that goal. And so animals are driven not only, by teleology at the level of desire, like hunger, or emotions like longing, but also ideas, right? So, for example, let's say I have my child is running around on some very populated beach, and then I freak out and I realize, oh my God, I can't see my 4-year-old. Where is she? And there's thousands of people. What will I do? I'll typically think, okay, she was wearing a red bathing suit, so I'll reduce my search space. I'll attend to red volitionally on the basis of my reasoning that she's wearing red. I'll reduce my search space. I'll begin looking among red things. My eye movements will look around at red things and no deterministic order. I mean, there's many ways to skin the cat. I can look this way, but sequentially at red things, or that way at red things. And then, so my eye movements are slaves in a sense to my higher level goals. Then I'll find her and I'll say, you shouldn't run around like that. But then she'll say, Papa, I'm starving. Okay, well, then I'll go say, okay, let's go look for a restaurant. I'll look around. My eye movements, again, will be, in a sense, slaves to my higher level reasons. But then I might, those reasons are not simply driven by the world. They're also driven by internal ideas. I may say, oh my God, today's Ramadan. We can't go to the restaurant. We have to wait till tonight, for example. So I think both the idea of criterial causation and the idea of cybernetic causation have a lot in common. And they both have in common the idea that there's many ways to skin a cat. That's what we say in America, right? So, just as if I push you, there's many ways to become upright again. If I have a criterial system, something as simple even as a mouse trap, right? There's many ways to catch a mouse, but also there's many different kinds of things that will set off a mouse trap. Right? You can even think of a neuron as like a little tiny mouse trap. It's waiting for a certain pattern of input, but corresponding to a meaning, right? For example, there are these high-level idea neurons, I think they're called, concept neurons that Itzhak Fried and Christoph Koch discovered in the hippocampus, where, I mean, they're really remarkable. These neurons will fire, for example, if you show the epilepsy patient a picture of or a movie of, say, Oprah Winfrey, or you play her voice, or you show the word Oprah Winfrey, the neuron fires seemingly identically. I mean, that's remarkable. So this notion of multiple realizability, I think, is really at the heart of the matter. There's many ways to skin a cat. And I would simply add to that also, and I'll just end there, is that the multiple realizability is not only the idea that there's multiple ways to, there's multiple microscopic, synchronic, or, moment in time ways to, set off the mousetrap. It's also at the level of function. There's many different functions that can meet a certain need, right? So if I'm an animal looking for an escape route, I'm not doing complex calculus to figure out I'm looking for anything that's good enough, right? It's just good enough to get me out of Dodge. I can get away from the predator. Okay, I'll end there. I can go on for hours. My children tell me I always talk too much. So.
All right. All right, Peter, that is very insightful. Thanks so much. So what I have in mind now is for all of us to discuss, but perhaps maybe in the first few minutes, but one thing that we could do is maybe we can stick to a few questions of clarification, if there are any. To read the paper, or if you had the opportunity, but still a few things are not as clear. So maybe we can, if you have any clarification question, you can just either raise your hand or just ask directly. So that's what I would suggest we do first for.
Hello, could I ask a question, maybe? Oh, sorry, Alicia raised
Yeah, you know what? I think since Louise seems to be frozen, maybe I'll act as chair myself. So yeah, Alicia, go ahead.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. I'm actually a graduate student currently at MIT. I wonder
Great.
if and I'm very curious about your take on like the manifold approach to study neuropopulation activity versus like the affordance-based representations. Like, what is the difference between the two?
Hmm.
And conceptually and also like methodologically, how do you acquire like we know manifold, like basically
Yeah,
you do
yeah,
dimensionality reduction on a bunch of um, neurons. I wonder like what do you mean exactly by
yeah.
affordance?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and it's something that I've been really excited to see, but like as a bystander. So I don't do this work myself, but in reading the literature that in systems neuroscience, there's a bunch of work that has taken this sort of manifold approach to look at really high dimensional neural data from various recordings of maybe sometimes thousands of neurons in different parts of the brain and say, okay, these are the patterns that correspond to the interesting things in the input or the dimensions of the input and so on, right? And that becomes really interesting just as a straightforward kind of encoding of the data, right? There's some sensory data, and it encodes it in a way that now presents it to the rest of the nervous system in a useful way, right? So this part of the nervous system has done some work to categorize inputs such that the rest of the nervous system can use that. But what's been really interesting to me is that actually recently there's been a bunch of work that's shown that the way that that's done is sensitive to the task that the animal is doing, sensitive to the opportunity, sensitive to the state of the animal. So it's much more sort of contextually rich than just a straightforward, isolated kind of bottom-up perceptual encoding. So that's what I mean by the affordance kind of stuff, and it's what I think Peter was sort of referring to as well. The idea that any of these patterns is not just about something; it's also for something, and what it's for shapes the way that it encodes what it's about. So and that can change, right? That's contextual from moment to moment. It's historical based on what the animal has learned. It's based on its current state. It's based on what it's attending to, as Peter also mentioned. So there's a ton of sort of real-time flexibility in the system and also historical contingency that shapes the representations that an animal has in order that it can best use them for its adaptive behavior. So that's what I mean, Alicia. And there's a bunch of new systems neuro papers that have come out just in the last year that we refer to in the paper. I'm sorry, I don't remember all the details of them right off the top of my head. But if you're interested, you can see some of that, some examples there. And also, it refers back to interesting sort of conceptual theoretical work by people like Walter Freeman, who was really, I think, ahead of his time in understanding both that we get population encoding is important, and secondly, that it's the relevance of the stimulus for the animal that's encoded, not just the stimulus in some raw kind of state. I hope that
May
made
I
sense.
may I add to that we should not try to attempt to reduce causation, even of animal behavior, solely to what's going on in the brain or the nervous system, even because the relationship of the animal to the world is also inherent to the outcome of that behavior. So, for example, if I have a fish swimming in water, it's able to swim forward if it does this, given the nature of water. If I take the same fish and I put it in air, like on a dock, and it does this, it's not going anywhere, right? So the causal efficacy of a of neuronal activity combined with motor output depends not only on what's going on in the animal, but its relationships to the world. That's true also of humans at the level of meaning. So, for example, I can have identical input, and say a bunch of people sitting at tables. Now, if my mental model is that this is a restaurant, I cannot sit at the tables. That would be inappropriate. If my mental model is that this is a casino, I can sit at the tables, right? So, what's going on and what is appropriate or good behavior or useful behavior depends not only on invisible things like, it's not that are not in the input, like my mental model, but also the state of the world. So let's say I have the wrong mental model and it's actually a restaurant, but I think it's a casino, and I sit at the table, people will respond strangely to me.
Yeah. No, I think that's great, and actually just it kind of encapsulates the notion that of how meaning is different from information in the sense that meaning is inherently relational. Right. So every aspect of meaning is relational. It just doesn't inhere in a pattern by itself. It inheres in how it's interpreted. And that's true within the nervous system, but it's also absolutely true in terms of the relations between the animal and its environment in ways that provides then the context and the relevance filter for what it's representing internally.
All right, great. Actually, I have a question that follows on this discussion. So I'll take the liberty and ask it now, because, and I think this a central theme of the paper in a way, which was interesting because in the paper itself, so both Kevin and Peter are really emphasizing the contextual and sort of general background conditions in which a system is, however demarcated, a system is embedded in as something necessary to take into account to understand causation more broadly, right? So whether via encapsulating that in terms of constraints or in some other fashion. But here's the question, right? So in your paper, Kevin, I think, I reheard it this morning, and if I didn't miss it, I think you only talk about the nervous system, and probably even like the central nervous system. And so the question that I have, and I've had for a long time with my colleagues who do an action type of research, like Evan Thompson and many others that have had similar ideas about the coupling between an organism and the environment, and that coupling itself being central to causation and to many other things, is how do we avoid stepping through all of the universe, so to speak? Because where does the boundary of a system end? In a sense, it doesn't end. And in a sense, it has to, because or maybe it doesn't. Do we have to consider the entire universe? Because I remember asking this very same question to Evan 15, 20 years ago in a symposium we were together, because he was emphasizing this nature of it can't be a brain within a vat.
Yeah,
and you need a body, and you need an environment, and you need everything. So these background conditions extend, right? So one of the things that I'm utterly ignorant about but fascinated is the interactions between the nervous system and the immune system. And the more we learn, the more we see that they're coupled in really strong ways and really fascinating ways. So you can't stop with the nervous system. You have to include the immune system. So, I mean, you get the idea. So you have to keep going.
Sure.
So how do we understand this? How do we demarcate, or demarcation is a bad thing? How do you both think about that?
Well, I might throw this to Henry in a second, but I'll have a stab at it myself. I guess, so you're talking about it in spatial terms, like where does the system end spatially, and what are the other sort of physical, components of it that are relevant to it at any time? And I think you could say, of course, I see the brain as a control system. So it's there to control the body, which means controlling the physiology, but also the state of the body, right? And it's sort of monitoring what state is the body in. What's the state of the universe? What should I do? Not the universe. What's the state of me as in my zone of control, or the zone in which I can perceive things from, right? And so for creatures with vision, that zone is huge. The zone that it can perceive things in is huge. For creatures like a worm, like a C. elegans, that doesn't have vision, it's only touching things or smelling things, which is basically touching things with its odorant receptors. Then its world is just right here and right now, right around it. So it's right here in the sense that it doesn't have any spatially extended sensation, but it's also right now as a consequence of that. And I think that becomes really interesting, is to take your question and convert it into the temporal domain and ask, for an organism, what is the temporal reach that it cares about, both in the past, right? Or what is its memory like? Is it only remembering things that happened in the last 30 seconds, biochemically speaking, or is it doing synaptic plasticity and associative learning and biographical learning and so on, over a lifetime? And then, even more importantly, I think, what is the time horizon over which it is planning? Because when you start to think about behavior, it's not just moment by moment, choice by choice. It's a lot of our behavior and, more interesting animals that can sustain goal-directed behavior over the length of time it requires to achieve the goal, right? It's not just instantaneous. You don't just choose to do something and then you do an action and it accomplishes whatever you wanted, right? Sometimes it takes a long time and you have to be able to sustain that. So what's really interesting, if you look at the cognitive horizon, I think what Mike Levin calls the cognitive light cone, which I like, of different organisms, is that you can see, that the relevance of things, the scale of relevance becomes really different. And that, I think, temporally speaking, and I find that to be, really interesting. And it just throws a stark kind of spotlight on what makes us so interesting and what makes our own cognition and behavioral control so powerful. Henry, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, I mean, it's a really interesting and deep question. I guess I would add that on that temporality dimension we were talking about, I don't think we have to worry too much about this kind of causal bloat worry, because at least under the framework we were trying to sketch, historical causes are only going to have an impact on behavior insofar as they serve as these structuring causes on the current state of the system. So something that the system doesn't remember can't be causal kind of in the present under that model. So we draw a line, I guess, on that causal bloat worry, because I guess, yeah, the system can only be responsive to the things it remembers. I guess the other thing I would say is that it's going to depend on what your explanatory target is. I know that's a bit of a philosopher thing to say, but I think the point of this paper was to encourage more pluralism or more expansive view of causation against the backdrop of this quite limited reductive view of causation. But it's not to argue that everything is causal. It's just to say we have to look a bit further afield, I think. And really what it's going to come down to is the thing you're trying to explain, and what kind of causes from this more expansive repertoire are going to be helpful for you for predicting, controlling, and explaining, I think, in that context.
Yeah, I think
that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Kevin. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to just emphasize that point about the the target. What it like the answer to a lot of these questions of what are the causes, like why do you want to know? What are you trying to do? That will determine the right level at which you should be asking the questions. And I think that's I think that's really key there.
Yeah, no, that's a good
So
point.
let me add to what Kevin and Henry said. The answer, I think, to your question, Luis, is it depends, right? Because for example, if someone shoves me, I just need a way to minimize the error signal of me being off verticality. And there's many ways to, get back to vertical. There's not a single way to do it, but I just need a way to reduce that error signal. I don't need to have a whole model of the world. I don't need to compute calculus or anything. I just need to reduce that error signal. Now, there are other cases of goal-seeking behavior that require much more complicated notions of the world, right? So it turns out that orangutans in Borneo will hike through the forest or swing through the forest for 200, 300 miles to get to the durian that will fruit in 2 weeks. So clearly they have some kind of mental map, and along the way they might get knocked off the tree, or they might have, they'll be able to get up again. It's like that old song, I get knocked down, but I get up again. You can't stop that You can't stop that orangutan from finding that durian, and there's many, many ways to get to the durian. But in order to do that, the orangutan does need a very complex mental map and needs an extended view of the world. I mean, really, this demarcation problem, I think, was first, to my knowledge, framed by Willie Quine, where he asked the question, how does a child even know what a mother is talking about when she says, oh, look at the rabbit, right? And how does the baby know that she's referring to that closed object moving over there on the grass, as opposed to the ears at 3 p.m. plus that branch over there, right? So there has to, in some way, be some sort of innate basis for demarcating. And I think that, the work of Liz Spelke, of Sue Carey, and other child psychologists, developmental psychologists, say that we have innate grouping procedures that bias us to favor closed shapes that are moving together. A lot of these Gestalt grouping principles kind of have to be built in order to bootstrap up to the level of a rabbit. Okay.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. That was really informative. Yeah, actually, I had a little bit of a freezing at one point here, but I see a few messages.
Yeah, I was just looking at those too. Can I just
don't think
respond
they
to them?
were addressed, right? So like,
No, they weren't.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
let me reiterate or mention that feel free to ask via the message, that the chat function, and I can read it for you, or raise your hand. But let me take at least one question. It's already on the chat, and that's a question from Drew Headley. And the question is, how does the notion of downward causation fit into your framework?
Yeah.
Maybe Kevin can address that.
Yeah, it's really key. And I think partly, again, Peter referred to it already, the idea, for example, that when you decide on a goal, then what you're doing is actually having a top-down constraint within the sort of hierarchical system, where the bit of the brain that's choosing the goal is sending signals down to part of the brain that's choosing an activity that can accomplish that goal, and then that's sending signals down to parts of the activity, the brain that will choose an actual action to accomplish the activity, and so on. So, there's good evidence for that sort of hierarchical, nested hierarchy of behavioral control. And if you want to understand the causes of a behavior, then I think you need to understand what are the goals that an animal has right now. When I do this, when I give it this stimulus, if I want the full explanation, I need to know that, because it's not just, in a lab, in an experiment, it may be just literally just sitting there. But in the wild, that's not what's happening, right? Animals are going about their day doing stuff with goals, with agendas over various time frames, and that means that when they encounter something, it's not a stimulus response kind of a thing. It's an interpretation of new information. It's an accommodation to a new situation, depending on what was going on already, and that's where the top-down causation comes into play. And the nervous system is just, I think, structured in that kind of a way where some of those activities are aimed at and maintained over longer time frames. So the bit of the brain that's thinking about goals is concerned with things that are occurring over longer time frames than the bit that's just concerned with direct motor actions. That's the way I would think of it.
Can I just jump? Oh, no, you go.
Yeah, please go ahead.
I'll add that very quickly, that the sort of constraint, top-down imposition of new constraints that will therefore change the future behavior of the system is not only ending up in motoric activity, it can also be it can result in mental activity.
Absolutely.
So, for example, if I say, I can give you something like, think of a politician. Poof, you think of somebody, say Trump, God forbid, and then I'll say, oh no, actually think of a woman politician, and you'll be like, oh, I don't know, Indira Gandhi. Now I'll say, okay, actually, I meant to say, think of a European woman politician. Right, and I can constrain the constraints ever more tightly. I mean, in some extreme cases, there'll be only one, who's your mother? What's your mother's maiden name? There's only one answer. But in the former example, why did you say, whatever you said, Margaret Thatcher versus Victoria May versus Angela Merkel? Well, if I rewound the system and played the constraints identically, you might have said someone else. But it's not random, utterly random, because it had to be a European woman politician. right? You didn't just say, ants dancing in a top hat, right? You didn't say some completely random thing. So I think that, this touches on the issue of free will and multiple realizability, but the issue is that, again, there's multiple ways to skin a cat, and a given system can actually come to very different answers, all of which meet those particular constraints. And that can be entirely internal. So in this case, I gave you the constraints, but often we give ourselves the constraints. Like, I want to have some friends over for dinner. Oh, okay. Who should I have? And you play it out in your imagination, and then you say, oh, okay, well, this guy and this woman and da da da. And then you say, okay, good. Oh, but Ramesh is vegetarian. What can I make that's vegetarian? Oh, I can make falafel. Oh, actually, don't. Oh, okay. How about spinach lasagna? Okay, let's go with that. And then you say, okay, but I don't have spinach. Okay, where's my car keys? I got to go to the supermarket and get spinach. So a lot of this internal dialogue in our internal imagination results in behaviors that are driven solely by internally generated considerations or deliberations.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really key, and it re-emphasizes the notion that cognition is real, and that the neural activity is just the medium that instantiated. We shouldn't reduce it to that.
Great. Okay, so let me switch up a little bit here. Sean, do you have a question?
Yes, yeah. Hi. Yeah, this is fascinating. Really interesting. I'm wondering how this agency paradigm extends to the evolutionary theory itself. Because I find there's something very unsatisfying, something unsatisfying about the theory as we conceptualize it now. And I think it's because we're not accounting for the role that agency plays in our own development as a species and perhaps our own origin. And because I find that agents and minds specifically have this privileged access to produce these top-down constraints that produce function.
Yeah.
And so we look at our brain and we say, well, it's this masterpiece of an organ. And yet, because of the sort of almost like a dogmatic thinking that we have, that we're attached to sort of an idea that the entire process of the origin of the brain is just some sort of random process, that it's also a hodgepodge and it's also a hot mess. And I find those two things are highly conflicting. And I just wonder, if there is some sort of agential or aspect to the evolutionary process, because I find that foresight is required in order for there to be any function whatsoever, because the function implies that you understand what each component part of a system, what role each component part plays, not just as an individual part, but as what it plays in the context of the larger goal and the larger function as a whole.
Yeah.
I feel like you need.
Yeah, no, I mean those are great questions, Sean, and I think so. Let me say a few things. First of all, Henry and I have written a bit about this recently as well, of the idea that both within individual morphological development of an individual embryo, but also across evolution, that there's some aspect of agency at play in those things. And there's some people who are advancing that idea, like Dennis Walsh and others. And Henry and I actually wrote a paper that I think we sort of see as a kind of a corrective maybe to an overreach there, that you don't actually need to have that kind of agential aspect where an organism is literally in charge of its own development, and organisms and lineages are somehow in charge of their own evolution. You can have aspects where what organisms do affects the way that they evolve, because they are creating their own environment, they're creating their environment for each other, they're affecting all the other species that they're interacting with in ways that feeds back in terms of the selective pressures that it generates. So, but the larger point, I guess I would say, is that what Darwin showed us is that we really don't need any foresight, right? That's the magic of evolution as an algorithm, is that you really can take some stuff, randomly let it change a little bit, and then it's not that you, by just randomness by itself, you get something like the brain. The trick is you do randomness plus selection for a little bit of an improvement or change, and then you do that over and over and over again across populations of thousands and thousands of individuals and many millions sometimes of generations, right? And so what you get is apparent design without a designer. And that's sort of the key of evolution, where you get functionalities that have just been happened upon because of chance at some level, but the good ones are retained. That's the key. It's like it's a ratchet-like mechanism. So you can get true functionality and apparent design without a designer.
May I add to that? This ratchet idea is really interesting, right? So a goal of an animal, say to escape predators or to find food, can lead to essentially changes in its behavior, which will then serve as the basis for future natural selection. Or for example, there's the so-called Baldwin effect, right? So let's say all these animals live on the ground, and then suddenly a new predator emerges, and everybody scurries up into the tree to escape the predator. Well, now that the subjective desire to escape the predator leads to a change in the environment, which over many generations will then select for an ability to climb trees better. Or, take the example of the evolution of echolocation. So there had to be some, ancestral bat or dolphin that kind of was looking for food and stumbled upon the, finding that if I make clicky sounds, I actually can locate it. And then once that first individual kind of stumbled upon that, this could be, the basis for future selection. So the subjective then, like I want to escape a predator, I desire food, can then recreate an environment which then is subject to selection.
Yeah. So you get an interplay between what organisms are doing, what the selective pressures are that they face, and then what it becomes good for them to do. And so yeah, it's that evolution is very much more an interplay where a kind of a creative process in the sense that organisms are creating their environments and their selective pressures, but not a teleological process in the sense that anyone's in charge of it or trying to drive it. There isn't a goal to evolution. It's just like whatever can happen that turns out to be adaptive, may happen. That's basically the way I see it.
That was excellent. Yeah, just a quick just to add to that quickly. I've been looking at Dennis Noble's work and his work on physiology and his interpretation of the organism itself being able to influence its own phenotypic expression and how its decisions actually can epigenetically penetrate the germline and actually influence and pass on traits that were made through the conscious, deliberate decisions of the organism to its children. So I find that there's some evidence, if not just epigenetically, but also through sexual selection, where creatures are choosing by conscious, through agency, who they're going to mate with and what kind of genes get expressed. So
Sure.
I think there's some sort of element of agency that's not completely accounted for, and
yeah, no, I mean, like I said, it's clear that agency is involved in evolution. It's not clear that there's anything agential about evolution per se. And I won't go on a rant, but let me just say, I find the evidence for some of that transgenerational epigenetic work of behavioral traits extremely unconvincing. That's a whole other topic for another day.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay,
can I just add? Can I just add to that?
Oh, yeah, of course, yeah.
The kind of nuance or line that we were trying to find in that chapter that Kevin was talking about, was trying to find that line between saying, of course, kind of agency and behavior has observable influences on evolution that are important to kind of factor into our models. So just, look at niche construction, whatever, as an example. But that doesn't imply that some have claimed that there is evidence that species are trying to evolve or wanting to evolve. And we don't think you need to take that step in order to acknowledge the first step, is the kind of.
Yeah, on that note, I'm actually going to flip things a tiny bit here in the order, because giving Henry an opportunity to provide his ideas as well, because there's a question on the chat by Anastasia that says, Henry, you mentioned that a system cannot have a cause that it cannot remember. Is this equivalent to cannot reconstruct/represent? How do we reconcile this notion with the idea of multiple realizability?
Yeah, interesting. Good question. I guess I was meaning that in the context of this idea of, okay, if we take this more expansive repertoire of causation into account when we're thinking about behavior, does that mean we have to include the wider reaches of the universe or the beginning of the universe as a cause of the behavior? So that was kind of the context, but I like the idea. Yeah, I guess, I mean, I would say it's relevant to reconstruction and representation, but also relevant to just kind of noticing or being causally impacted by something, right? If you didn't notice something or it didn't happen kind of close to you, then it's not the sort of thing that can serve as a structuring cause into your wider kind of constraint regime that's going to then inform your future behaviors. So yeah, that's kind of how I would think about that. I don't know if that answers your
Yeah,
question.
I might just add to that, if I might, that you know, it's adaptive to not remember everything. It would be really, really maladaptive if every sort of synaptic firing was subject to synaptic plasticity. And instead, you know, the synaptic plasticity is gated by neuromodulators that signal arousal and attention and relevance and salience and reward and so on, so that we remember the things that are most adaptive for the organism and we forget most of the other things. And so that's where, you know, when we say that the system incorporates its past history, it does that in a really selective way that's most adaptive for its own future behavior.
May I add to that? This is relevant to the neural code, I think, right? So neurons, in one sense, have a memory in that you can change their synaptic weights through long-term potentiation, changing, you know, the expression of dendrites and so forth. But in another sense, neurons don't have a memory because, you know, when an action potential or a spike arrives from a presynaptic neuron, it'll drive a change in the potential of that neuron. That's called an excitatory postsynaptic potential, or it might be an inhibitory postsynaptic potential. But to reach the firing threshold, you need to say, I'll just arbitrarily say 5, boom, 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 boom. And then you'll get a spike. Now, if what happens with an excitatory postsynaptic potential that doesn't arrive in the context of 5 at once is that it decays because there's sodium pumps that pump out the ions. And then after the decay of that excitatory postsynaptic potential is as if that preceding spike never happened. The neuron forgets. It has no memory of that spike having arrived. Now, the beauty of the system is that it's set up to be sensitive only to certain patterns of arrival. Say, in this case, 5 spikes have to arrive within a certain tiny time window. For a pyramidal cell in the neuron, it's typically about 25 milliseconds, counts as the same time. Boop, 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 boop. Hit threshold, I fire. There's kind of 2 ways to get 5 spikes at once. One is for, you know, say 5 different neurons at the preceding level to all fire synchronously. So synchrony is obviously part of the neural code. Another way is for a single neuron to fire like crazy 5 times within 25 milliseconds. And so bursting has to be another part of the neural code. Anyway, I just wanted to bring in the idea of, you know, memory loss plays a function because by having memory loss, you now have neurons that are sensitive to patterns of input, namely simultaneity. The whole nervous system is set up primarily as a coincidence detection system, whether driven by simultaneous arrival via synchrony or bursting.
Yeah. Now,
Right, thanks.
sorry, go ahead, Louise.
Yeah,
I'm just noticing that Tom has had his hand up for a while.
Yeah, I was gonna give the chance for Tom to ask his question. Yeah.
Hey, thank you. Hey, Kevin, fantastic paper. Henry, really
thanks.
liked it. I've given Kevin all kinds of grief about free will online. So, but I really like what you've done here. But of course, I have a question about agency and top-down causation. You say that causal slack, some kind of indeterminism in the system, is necessary for top-down control, real agency. I'm not contesting the idea that there's indeterminism in the human system. I'm sure there's plenty of it. My question, though, is whether it's been shown that this kind of causal slack is necessary for top-down control. If you think of artificial systems that are designed to be maximally deterministic, let's say, in their microscopic subcomponents, don't they still have the capacity to control and be autonomous and agential? I mean, we're coming to the point where the question is really upon us. Artificial systems are poised if they don't already have a certain kind of agency. And there's no reason to think, as far as I know, that there's causal slack or indeterminism down there in the subparts. I mean, there might be, but let's hypothesize there isn't.
Yeah.
I guess I'd put this, I would say, I think the challenge is to sort of show formally that indeterminism is necessary for top-down control, and I'm not sure that's been shown.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair to say that it hasn't formally been shown necessarily. I think there's some, I have some intuitions about it. But what I would say is that, if we think about the laptop that I'm using right now, it is highly crafted in a way that actually buffers indeterminacy in low-level stuff, right? It's made that it has to be engineered that way. So there's a problem. It's not just that the indeterminacy is like a resource that that you need to draw on. It's a problem for agency, right? So you can flip the script and say, like, rather than saying we'll assume determinism and then ask where does the control come from, we can assume, we don't have to assume, we can look at the evidence from physics and from neuroscience and say there is indeterminacy at low levels of physics. There's noise in nervous system, so this is a problem for the organism. How can it be an agent given it's got these noisy components? And one way to think about that is, like, absent any kind of macroscopic top-down control, loads of things could happen just based on the low-level physical organization of the system. Many things could happen immediately, and then more as you go further and further in time, that cone of possibilities just expands. So, the way I like to think of it is that actually what living systems do is actually resist that sort of second law of thermodynamics by keeping everything constrained, right? They're doing, in a sense, the macroscopic organization is doing thermodynamic work. It's taking in energy to keep making itself happen through time. And so a way to think about agency then is that in the first instance, that's really the way that I think that's what life is. It's taking advantage of the fact that macroscopic organization can do some causal work to keep the microscopic organization going in the face of this challenge of indeterminacy. And then it's also, evolution is in a sense also taking advantage of the indeterminacy by selecting functionalities that allow things like control systems and behavior that also enable the system to keep persisting, especially in the dynamic, highly changeable environment. So for me, I think you can, I guess I like to reverse the premise and see where we go from there. And when you do that, it highlights the fact that the indeterminacy and noise is a challenge in the first instance. But then I would also say that because that generates causal slack, that's the very thing that allows macroscopic organization to have any top-down control.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what I'm questioning. I don't see how everything you just said up to this very point was sort of on my side of the argument. So I still will say how causal slack is essential for a system to exert top-down control. I mean, you could have components that are perfectly deterministic logic gates, and still control systems would be perfectly happy with that. But I won't press the question.
No, it's good because there's two sort of ways to look at it. And one is to say, what would it take in a system right now? We have a system configured in a certain way, and we say it's deterministic, but I have put in macroscopic control, right? I can design a system like that, absolutely, and it could be completely deterministic and work the way I want it to at macroscopic levels. The question for me, though, is how would that happen otherwise? Like why would you get a system like that in a deterministic universe? You wouldn't get it spontaneously. I can make it, right? And but it wouldn't just happen. That's so there's an uber meta argument to be made about why you would ever get systems that seem to have agency and that seem to exert control and that have these functionalities and that use energy to do it. I mean, it's very inefficient, right? I mean, it's very energy expensive. So so that's a broader kind of meta argument about the need for some indeterminacy in order to get the kind of agent that could have control, whether it's needed in real time or not.
Yeah, okay. I see those as two different issues, but You may be right. Maybe indeterminacy was necessary to get us humans to where we are now. I'm not sure it's necessary for AI that it needs it at all. But we will
I think you
see.
Yeah, yes, we will. Yeah,
Thanks, Kevin.
I think so. Thank you.
Yeah, let's try to wrap up by 30 past the hour.
Okay.
But before we have a little bit, let's say next 10 minutes, I think there are a couple of questions here on the chat that I think are really interesting, because they're trying to get back to, okay, I'm a neuroscientist. I do some kind of I'm going to speak on myself, like some small scale thing in my lab, and like very focused on some minor question of some sort. And how do I take these ideas to change the way I do, or to not change, or to expand, or to consider, or to broaden the way I think about my problems and my analyses? And so I'm going to take a question from the chat here from Joshua Gertler, who says, do you know if there are mathematical models that can identify necessary systems and then sufficient systems / states? I'm thinking about the best way to apply this new paradigm for causation to neuroimaging data, right? So I think that a lot of times that we hear this all the time, these kinds of discussions are great, but how does it change the way that I do my neuroscience day to day? Again, my lab, these small questions, small context and whatnot. How do I benefit from these ideas?
No,
Any
I mean, it's absolutely the key kind of question, because it's the payoff, right? The payoff for neuroscientists, as opposed to just saying, well, okay, all this holistic contextual stuff is fun to talk about, but like, how does it help me in the lab? And I think, I mean, my first response is just that it feels to me like systems neuroscience is moving this direction already, and that we kind of need a conceptual framework in which to couch all of the theoretical advances that are happening, where people are looking for patterns, right? You know, population coding is now very well entrenched as a way of thinking about what's happening in the nervous system. And just coupling that with the idea of historical contingencies, and that, you know, the representations have a meaning that's contextual, and you can have top-down constraints, and there's no sort of violation of any metaphysical law to say that one part of the nervous system can affect another part and impose constraints on it. So it feels to me like it's already happening in systems neuroscience, and that, you know, what we're offering, I think, is a sort of set of philosophical resources that people can turn to. So when they're confronted with all of this sort of richness now of the neuroscience literature, you know, they can draw on history of thinking that's already been done, that can help. And, you know, just thinking, for example, of triggering causes and structuring causes. You know, it's a really simple idea that I have personally just found very helpful in thinking about understanding the causes of behavior. So I guess that's my sort of general sense. But let me just say one other thing, and this relates to clinical work, especially in psychiatry. So I do a lot of work in psychiatric genetics, and the goal there has always been to find the biological causes of things like, you know, psychosis or mania or epilepsy, whatever. And with the goal that you know, when you get the genetics, you'll find some molecular biology there. Those will be new therapeutic targets. So really, from the most bottom-up way you could imagine, that is tweaking some molecules, you can affect the system's behavior, right? And that's kind of been a goal of psychiatric genetics and a goal of psychiatry in general, to find drugs like that. But that's only one way to affect the system. You can also affect it in the most top-down way imaginable, which is by talking to somebody, right? By having them consider ideas mentally. And that's not, it's not a fantasy, right? I mean, you can literally, of course, you can affect the system physically by doing that, right? You can inculcate habits of thought, you can try and get rid of other habits of thought, and so on. So, you know, to me, there's an aspect there in clinical practice, which, I mean, it's not saying anything new. People are already doing this. It just, in a sense, I think, warrants it from a neuroscientific perspective. We don't have to be these sort of rabid reductionists who just see everything as a malfunctioning mechanism, we can at the same time see a person and say, you know, actually I can talk to that person and they have some control over themselves in an agential kind of a way. To me, that's a somewhat enriching, I guess, humanizing view, but also one that I think has real practical importance to it.
May I add to that for a minute?
Yeah, I was going to ask, Peter, can you give your take on this? Yeah.
So, you know, reductionism is the dominant sort of metaphor of the West. Other cultures like Chinese culture emphasizes a holistic view of causation. But even within the West, there has been always a kind of minor theme of awareness of whole patterns as causal. And so in the case of our field, you know, the work of Konrad Lorenz, Tinbergen, and what they called ethology in the 1920s, I believe, was very much focused on holism. So in contrast to, say, you know, J.B. Watson and later Skinner, this kind of notion of, you know, animals' states, brain states or behavioral outputs being driven by the input, you know, so they're simply stimulus response systems. Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz didn't jump into it with the assumption that animals were, you know, solely stimulus driven, that there was some agency to the animal. And so what they did is they gave, I think Konrad Lorenz said, let's just see what the animals do. And he put flowers there. And then he, you know, the bees would go there and come back and he just watched what they did. And he discovered the, I guess it's 3-parameter dance, right? The degree of wiggle, the angle of the figure eight, the size of the figure eight. Someone like Skinner, you know, driven by operant conditioning or, you know, classical conditioning, like earlier people focus on the stimulus response metaphor, would never have discovered that, right? You had to take a holistic notion of the animal as agentic and having its own agenda, and then we just simply observe. So I would love it to see, you know, if our field moves more in an ethological direction and rediscover holism. But I would add to that is, since the question was specifically about brain imaging, I mean, going back to Power's notion of control theory, which is really a kind of version of, you know, Norbert Wiener's cybernetic theory that takes into account the subjective. One key idea is that brain states are not driven by the input. Brain states determine the future input, right? So I look around in fulfillment of my goal to find a restaurant, right? So the field of fMRI research, which I'm, you know, engaged in, is kind of, you know, stuck, I think, in a certain corner unnecessarily. One is, you know, we're stuck in sort of noun land. We show people in the scanner faces or houses or scenes or tools, you know, all these nouns, and then we say, oh, okay, here's the tool area and here's the face area and blah, 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 right? Two things that are missing from that. One is that a lot of things are not nouns at all, but we have to look for the verbs of the mind, like attention would be a good example. I'm carrying out a mental operation that's not driven by the stimulus, but I volitionally choose to attend here versus here. Or I can carry out other mental operations like mentally rotating things. Like, so we should look for the verbs of the mind as well. But also, I think in terms of top-down processing, you know, one study we're doing now with Frank Tong looks at this, right? So it turns out if you have two little dots around fixation and they simply go from here to here, you can either see it as in apparent motion going vertically or horizontally. And it turns out that you can volitionally control this. So you can choose to see the dots going vertically or horizontally. Well, before anything happens, we can say, try to intend to see it go vertically, and nothing's happening on the screen. Can we decode, where in the brain can we decode a top-down intention in the absence of any change in input? So there's different kinds of fMRI experiments you can do that are not simply saying, oh, how does the stimulus drive my brain state? Rather, how does my brain state drive how the future stimulus will be interpreted?
Yeah, can I just add one more thing to that, Louis?
Yeah,
or
please,
two thoughts,
please,
actually.
of course.
One, just to you know, reiterate the view that actually doing more naturalistic experiments, you know, having animals in more naturalistic environments, I think is just going to be much better than having them just you know, in a maze going left or right kind of thing. You know, it's very impoverished in terms of their behavior. And then secondly, you know, getting data from more parts of the brain at the same time, which is, as I was saying, so that's sort of the direction of travel of systems neuroscience. So we don't have to do any of the versions of reductionism that I was talking about, the vertical or the horizontal or the temporal ones. You know, we can try to expand those, and I think that will just serve us well.
Yeah, Henry, please. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, just one quick thing, because I think the question mentioned necessity and sufficiency, so looking for necessary and sufficient parts. I think one thing that might be taken, at least personally, I take as a lesson from the framework we were trying to develop and that Peter's developed, is that actually it encourages us to reflect on what we actually mean when we're looking for necessary and sufficient conditions or neural variables to explain something, because there's a great paper by Yoshihara, which essentially argues that in the strict logical sense, if this kind of framework of thinking of the brain as kind of deeply interdependent and integrated, then it's probably the wrong question to look for necessary and sufficient parts for anything, right? Because nothing is going to be sufficient in and of itself. That's the kind of reductive mindset that we've been tricked into thinking about these things through. Not tricked. We've fallen into thinking about these things through. So yeah, I just wanted to add that it encouraged us to reflect on, I guess, the logic of what we're actually asking when we ask for necessary and sufficient conditions.
Yeah, and I think that obviously jives with your own, you know, thrust of your own work, Louise, in your book, The Entangled Brain, and the, you know, the fact that this, when we do the isolation, it can be experimentally powerful, but we should just remember what we've done and not extrapolate from it, right? If you blow the system apart and you destroy the relations, then you can't say you understand the whole system, because the relations are the system. So yeah, the methods can be powerful. It's just a question of not, as Henry said, falling into this sort of well of theoretical reductionism, because as I said at the start of the talk, we're not committed to it. And actually the success of the methodological approach does not warrant it. It doesn't license it. So yeah, I think that having that, just being aware of what we're doing and the assumptions of our experiments will actually, as a much more general point, should lead to better science, I think.
Great. Peter, any final comment? Yeah.
I just want to add about logic, that these notions of necessity and sufficiency are very much from the perspective of the A inputs as opposed to the B evaluating perspective, right? So I mean, I could talk about neurons, but I could also talk about, you know, mates. You know, let's say that a woman is looking for a mate, and some man comes along, and you know, he's not necessary, right? He might think he's sufficient, but it's not about him. It's about how she evaluates him, right? And regardless of what he thinks, you know, it's up to her how he will be evaluated. And so we really need a new logical term, I think, beyond necessity and sufficiency, which is from the framework of the perspective of A as input. It's the notion of adequacy. So we almost need a new logical operator to be adequate, as an adequate satisfaction of my criteria. Okay.
That's what we can all hope for in our romantic relationships, Peter, is to be adequate.
On that note, I'm going to thank Peter, Kevin, and Henry for this really excellent, very inspiring, thought-provoking discussion. And yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to post this online hopefully later today or soon.
Right.
And we can continue this online or in some other form. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, Peter and Henry.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
guys.
all.
Thank you. Bye.